Slavery was the foundation of racism. Taking away the rights and dignity of people of a different color was what slavery was about. The putting down of an entire race and seeing or depicting them as inferior and animals. From the first slave trade in Africa to now, racism has been alive and well. The rights of the black people captured from Africa were immediately taken away. Africans were not able to do anything except work and obey their master. At this point, the slaves were considered property. It was not until the 1800s that slaves were considered a full person. They were criticized, mistreated, tortured, and abused, and could do nothing about it. These were the seeds that were planted and that would eventually grow into an enormous, hateful tree. A tree that is filled with racism and prejudice. At this point, African Americans were helpless. There was nothing they could do and no one they could turn to. What were they going to do? Racism could be considered segregation as a child. As we have seen, it has taken a toll on people of color. To this day, we have seen racism, violence, and torturing through police officers and African Americans.
From the start of slavery, racism and oppression has heavily influenced contextual times. The Jim Crow laws laid the foundation of what most people would categorize as police brutality. The police force and their idea of dominance during the 1960s created a racial bias in the minds of many white citizens. News and media portrayed African Americans as criminals, and the conflicts only began to increase. People of color were being incarcerated for an extensive period of time for minor crimes. Prison numbers began to skyrocket, and this is where the idea of all people of color being so-called thugs began. This has shaped the mindset of current police officers who grew up during this time period or have been surrounded by race throughout their life.
President Richard Nixon first coined the term war on drugs as a primary cause for the rising crime rate in the United States. President Reagan would later make it a priority during his term to eradicate the dangerous drugs from the street. His administration severely exaggerated the issue of drug abuse in the United States and successfully found a way for them to incriminate minority groups for this issue. Inner-city African Americans and Latinos living under poverty had already become heavily associated with abusing hard drugs such as crack cocaine, and the government and law enforcement served to exploit them. Although both crack cocaine and powdered cocaine were simply different forms of the same drug, when it came to court sentencing, possession of 1 ounce of crack cocaine equaled about 100 times the amount of powdered cocaine. This discrepancy, however, was no mistake. The government and law enforcement sought to punish the minority communities who were notorious in the past for abusing the cheaper and weaker form of crack cocaine. Both compounds, powder and crack, are chemically identical, but the powdered form is even more potent and dangerous, but since it was widely used in rich white communities from the people who could afford it, the punishment for that drug was far less severe. This evidence makes it clear how our law enforcement systems and penal systems have favored the white majority in the past, and how Nixon's war on drugs became a war on minorities and blacks.
Whether or not it is a mindset that police officers have or racism, it is plain to see that there is excessive force when dealing with minorities. The first instinct to some is to reject this idea because police are meant to serve and protect their citizens. A prime example of this is the Eric Garner case, which in the recording of his death, he was politely asking the officers that he did not want to be touched, and there was 2 officers on him. One head came up behind him and put him in a headlock, and they both forced him to the ground, where they held his head down, and a few times he says that he cannot breathe. He says a few times until he finally died. And this is a huge example of excessive force because it could have been handled plenty of different ways that would not have acted, wouldn't have ended in his death. And it was publicized and furthered a point of minorities being threatened by the people that they should be protected by. Tennessee Coates, in his article, The Paranoid Style of American Policing, brings up a story on how his dad would diffuse a situation with just his words and his actions. And he didn't have a gun or anything like that. He would just talk this one teenage boy down from being aggressive and showed a prime example on how a situation can be ended without losing life. And he had gone on to explain a case on where this one teenage boy named Quintonio LeGrier had a mental illness and was upset at his father and had grabbed a baseball bat and was knocking on his door. So the father called the police and two officers arrived at the house. One officer saw that Quintonio had a bat and interpreted it as a lethal weapon and shot him. And the one bullet somehow hit his neighbor, Betty Jones. So not only was one teenager killed, but also a neighbor who had nothing to do with the situation. But the mother of Quintonio, the guy, felt betrayed because police officers were meant to protect, but instead they were called to handle a situation, but ended up killing her son in the process.
Have you had any times where you felt unsafe around police?
Yes.
Could you give an experience?
When I was driving my truck about 20 years ago, I was stopped by police for no apparent reason. I was asked for my license and registration.
As a black male, what do you think of when you see police?
You want to be cautious when police when seeing police because you feel that you can be stopped for anything.
Have any of your family members or friends been stopped by police? Could you give an experience?
Yes. When I was a teenager, my friend, I would get stopped by police for doing nothing at all. I felt violated, and because I did not do anything.
How have you felt about the recent shootings of black people by police officers?
I felt that those shootings have not been justified. To me, this feels like a black person does not have, life does not matter. That's why I believe those protesters are necessary. The victims and families should feel at least some type of justice for the victim wrongful death.